and welcome to the Scotochronicast, the podcast which discusses all things relating to medieval Scotland. I'm your host, Dr. Kate Buchanan. This is episode 6, and I am honored to be joined by Dr. Linsey Hunter. Welcome to the Scotochronicast.
Hello.
Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. It's good to get back in touch.
Well, I'm glad that you are able to talk to me today about what you do. Would you like to tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Of course. So my name is Linsey Hunter, and I am a history lecturer at the Centre for History at University of the Highlands and Islands. So I am medieval by research, but I teach quite a broad range of stuff for UHI, which is really interesting and a lot of fun. So my thesis was done at St Andrews, and I'm a legal historian, so I spent a lot of time counting words and exploring legal change.
I have an increasingly newfound respect for legal historians. Since I've been working in a law firm, I am even more impressed.
Well, I will take that compliment because nobody ever says that about legal history. Legal historians are the unloved and often avoided conversationalists at general conferences because a lot of people don't really find it that exciting. And more fool them because it is quite a magical field in lots of ways. I can hear lots of people laughing at the use of magical. But and to understand how a society functions, one of the best resource pools that we looking at legal records and understanding how the people governing areas try to pass improvements. Now, whether they're all good is another story, but those conversations and processes of making customary things into formal laws and so on is fascinating and a really good way to understand a society.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, it is one of the best sources for looking at history that we have, especially for medieval Scotland. And yeah, I wouldn't be able to do my research without the survival of the legal documents. So it's incredibly important. And words are so much fun. I love words. I love really interesting words, and it's through legal history that you find the really interesting words.
It is, isn't it? Because you've got a good enough, consistent enough pattern of documents, even though we're a bit less fortunate in Scotland in some ways. But you've got this lovely, constant stream of documents so you can look for change over time and pick up on all these strange anomalies, and otherwise you might only see a hint of it in a play or a letter or so on. So I really like this ability to look for change over time.
Yes. I think my favourite term that I came across was messuage, which is just another term for a bit of land with some buildings on it. But I love it.
I did quite enjoy reading out charters in Latin charters, or not always in Latin, but I did enjoy reading them out loud in funny voices because you do get quite bored when you're when you're on your 4007. You do need to inject a little bit more fun into it, don't you? Sometimes. Yeah, it's great. There's all these strange little fragments that help us understand some weird vocabulary things nowadays. It's great.
Yeah.
Why did we stop using messuage? We should have kept it, shouldn't we?
I know. I don't, and who knows? Maybe there's some area that still does.
Should we bring it back? Is this a hill to die on?
Yes. Let's bring messuage back.
I am there.
Yeah, and I'm surprised at how many of the legal terms that were active in the medieval era are still part of our current legal system.
It's amazing, isn't it? It's something I wish that people could have a better understanding of. Obviously there's big obstacles for the general public and even people like us who have some good knowledge of legal history and legal sources. But in-depth knowledge of the law itself and how it works is a way. I go to a conference every 2 years, the British Legal History Conference, and it's attended by legal historians and it's attended by lawyers who also study history. And the difference between the two groups of people is astonishing, in way of speaking, in mannerisms, but also in how history. Really, really fascinating experiment.
Ah.
But yes, I wish that, I mean, this is one of the ways that people can maybe advance the dialogue of understanding legal history, but I would really like to be able to help the general public improve their understanding of how slow the law develops. The high-profile issues in the news at the moment, and they seem to have been going on for a long time. Even if we were to think of something like Black Lives Matter, it's been in existence for 7 years, but campaigning for change in that regard is decades in the making. So it's in that sort of context, it's really interesting to think about what we have on the statute books just now, that has been there for hundreds of years. And it's very interesting to think about why those things that are on the statute books are still relevant. You always get these comedy articles now and again about redundant statutes and things that have no relevance for society anymore, but it's much more preserved that is still relevant, and not so different to the conversations that were happening several hundred years ago.
Yeah, well, and the amount of effort that it takes and the time and bureaucracy that it takes to remove these laws, these statutes that are still on the books, it's like, well, who has time to commit to removing that when there's all these like much bigger issues going on right now that we should be paying attention to.
Oh my gosh, yes, there is not enough time. I think the key thing is you get a sense looking back at medieval history and thinking about times when life was changing very fast in Scotland and elsewhere, and I think we are very much in that general sense of frantically trying to catch up with the scale of change that's happening at the moment. So maybe looking to how past societies have dealt with some of the challenges might be helpful for policy and lawmakers today, but they don't have enough time as it is to deal with all the issues that need to be dealt with. So I doubt they have time to chat to a bunch of historians, but it would be nice if we could find some ways to help.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's really, really important. No, and it's, eventually we do end up with our stuff helping people, I think. It's just perhaps sometimes slower.
I hope so, yeah. Difficult conversations to have, but I hope that we will find ways to have some of these conversations and produce meaningful, positive changes.
Yeah, definitely. What brought you to studying medieval Scotland?
Well, I loved history at school, and I think probably quite a lot of people have this similar experience, but I had a really good history teacher. And it doesn't present me in the best light because I worked best when I worked with a teacher that I really respected and admired.
Mm-hmm.
But I had this amazing teacher at school, and he related to us as adults, the adults in training that we were.
Right.
And he encouraged us to think only about the topics we were studying, but to think about bigger issues and bigger questions. And he was brilliant. He had this most light touch way of embedding skills in you without you necessarily noticing. So a truly remarkable teacher, Mr. McCall. And if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now, probably, because I really, really related to history as something that made me happy. I was going off to study probably modern history, maybe early modern. Mm-hmm. We did, instead, I think as a break for the normal World War I, World War II.
Right.
History that it used to be, we did for our 6th year specialty. We did the 14th and absolutism, and it was fabulous. A lovely change. And it's like the fun stuff, the most fun stuff in the early modern period, I think, because it's to do hugely with the nitty gritty of theologians and worrying about the liturgy and so on. It's wonderful excess and display and so on.
Yes.
So I had lots of fun learning about that. So I thought, I'm going to go off to St Andrews and I'm going to learn about probably going to, which is what a lot of students say to us now, and we always laugh, but it's exactly what I did. Probably end up specialising in 20th century history on, maybe the Nazis or Louis XIV. And anywhere near that, because in World War I went to St Andrews and in fact I even went to the open day. This is really terrible. All the history departments had their little open, come and meet us, come and talk to us, learn a little bit about the degree.
Yep.
And I went to the modern one, went to the Scottish one. I was in next to go visit medieval history, and I thought, I'm not going to hear about medieval history. I'm not studying medieval history. And I signed up for the optional module of medieval history, semester 1, semester 2, because I needed other history credits. And I thought, well, it probably might be a bit useful. And
might as well.
It's just terrible. And then I went to my first lecture, and it was by Simone McDougall, who is amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And this first week of lectures fully made me realise that medieval history was far more interesting than anything else. And it was where I wanted to be. And I can't really articulate it, but it just made sense. And the week one, the lectures were about violence, love, and geography. And in that week when I met Simone McDougall and I met John Hudson, who went on to be my PhD supervisor, and in that range of topics, just in that first week of lectures, I realised that there was something here that really spoke to me. And it's just amazing. You don't expect these things to happen in your life, but all of a sudden you just know sometimes when you're supposed to be going somewhere or doing something. And that was one of those moments for me.
Excellent. It's fascinating how sometimes just one particular aspect of history can just very suddenly just capture you and cause you to change whatever you're doing for forever.
Yeah, and it's a lesson for me and for everyone to always be alert to what's going to make you happy, and what's going to suddenly come out of the quiet and grab your attention.
Yes, that's very true. It's very important to choose something to study that you actually enjoy and you find very interesting and stimulating. It's something I tell my students all the time as they are picking topics for their masters. Well, we call them capstones. Yeah, like this is an intense amount of work that is going to be put into this, and you need to like this topic, like really like it.
Yes. It's, if you don't start off loving it, you will find it much harder to make it through, because gosh, you will get sick of it after a while. It's weird. It's weird how cyclical it is, isn't it? Because I guess it's not. Well, is it cyclical or is it just a roller coaster ride? So, supervising students through their dissertations, trying to prepare them these ideas that not every day is going to be fun. Some days are going to be really hard, and other days are going to be utterly joyful. But I don't know how best to prepare students for that, because it's a weird feeling.
Yeah, and I think it's, I think the message comes across to some students are in a better place to understand that, and then some students just have to experience it themselves.
Yeah. Studying is hard. I mean, studying and writing are very hard skills. So I guess they're so desensitized to.
Yeah, it's not easy. It's not easy work. For those of you listening that think that reading and doing historical research is just fun, it is a lot of fun, but it's also hard work.
Try to communicate to students early on in their experience that there are moments where you can feel total exhilaration. I guess that's where the roller coaster analogy probably comes in better. But you see, like, first second years rolling their eyes at you, like, how could you possibly be exhilarated reading a source and having a thought? But it's true. Sometimes you get so excited by the fact you'd be able to write something so neat, so clearly, or even so snappily. Like it's a real experience.
So you then focused on medieval history. Did you focus on medieval Scotland during your undergrad, or did you do medieval in general?
I was medieval in general, and this is where I kind of differ from a lot of my colleagues, that I come down on the medieval side more than I come down on the Scotland side, which is it's a big sort of research divide in some ways. So I never did a module that was specifically on Scottish history. But every module that I did had Scottish history, and some had quite a lot of Scottish history in it.
Right.
And I'm thinking about when I was a PhD student and I was tutoring, the modules that I was tutoring on were usually the ones that did Scotland and the English Empire, which was the sort of high to late medieval British Isles and focused stuff. And I really enjoyed that relationship between Scottish history and the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of colleagues I know specialised specifically in Scotland and sort of refined their time period down a bit. And so it just kind of shows you that there are lots of different types of students and different things really appealed to them. So a good couple of my colleagues, thinking of Alison Chand, who was also at St Andrews for a time, wanted to go specifically to do a history degree, whereas I wanted to go and do a history degree.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, my undergrad's not even in medieval, it's in history, because I did random mix of modules. I did revisited absolutism, that was fun. I did a module on environmental history, that was great. Yes. Modern environmental history and disease. But then I did stuff that's very close to what I ended up specialising in. So I did a module called Courtroom Dramas, which was looking at the Chanson de Geste and Arthurian tales, and it was great fun deconstructing those texts to look at customary practices and legal knowledge and how court proceedings went or were recounted in literary tales and so on. So
excellent,
huge fun stuff, which is what I like. I like range, and I like looking for these big comparisons or big points of contrast and so on as well. Whereas there are a lot of people who like to go very Scottish focused and to try not to go out with Scotland. And it's just a preference for me. I'd rather do first camp rather than the second.
Yes. Yeah. My undergraduate is just in history as well, because there wasn't an option for focusing as much. But I took as many classes in medieval, both on the English studies side, any sort of medieval literature class that I could, as well as any medieval history class. And then I ended up taking, I decided I needed to learn Latin because, medievalists need to learn Latin. So I ended up taking Latin, but that was mainly run through the philosophy department at the school that I was in. So it was kind of a weird smattering of this is how you piece together a medieval history degree where there isn't really a medieval history degree.
It's impressive though. It's really not a lot of students have the capacity to think about that much forward planning and how can I put more of these steps in place earlier on in my academic career and save myself a bit of time later on too.
Yeah, I had the medievalist that I was working with was super awesome, and she really prepared me. Yeah, Susan Taylor, she just was super great. And she had me studying Latin. She had me studying paleography. She took me to Kalamazoo early so that we could go advisor shopping, which is where I stumbled into Richard Orham's presentation about Scottish castles. And then I was like, oh, that's what I'm doing.
That's really cool to have that mentorship where somebody was really helping you get into the place you needed to be.
Yeah. No, she was wonderful. Yeah, really, really supported me and pushed me and identified all this is what you need. This is what we're going to do. So that was great. But she was a scholar of medieval Italian history and focused on heresy. So I have an interesting background in just medieval history in general because of that.
It's good for these things to draw on when you start teaching.
Yes.
But it's really good to have that broader range of understanding to draw on when you're thinking about research project yourself as well. And I think having this frame of reference is really good for keeping you alert to connections that I might not see. And it's, there's so many different ways to be an academic, and I don't think there's a right way.
No.
There are definitely some wrong ways, and I'm sure we've all encountered some of them. I'm sure we've inadvertently done some of those things ourselves. But trying to teach an absolute way to do it is never really going to get people very far. There are so many different ways you could be an academic.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Something I'm observing with the newer generations of students that are coming through too is they're exposed to sources of information in a way that we were never exposed to. We were probably just too old to have had the full benefits of digital, the speed of the digital age. But the students I'm increasingly encountering are amazing in terms of multitasking and in terms of accessing information from lots of different places. And
yes,
there's lots of warning people about the dangers of the internet and so on. But the students I'm encountering are savvy and switched on and don't read a thing on social media and believe it. They read it, are intrigued, and then they go and do a bit of research about it. And in doing that, it doesn't matter if it's a topic about history or politics or science. They're training themselves to use these core humanities critical thinking skills to help them navigate the world, which is amazing.
Yeah.
It's really, really helpful. And I think some of them are quite surprised when we say this directly to them. It sort of connects a process they're doing normally, and that doing their degree is helping them refine and get better at, is a core humanities skill.
Oh yeah, definitely.
It's really cool, because I don't think young people are particularly used to being given compliments about the way that they access information,
right,
and the ways that they communicate digitally, which is a bit of a shame. People are too broad brush for that stuff, aren't they?
Yeah, so you did your undergraduate at St. Andrews. You also did your master's and PhD there, yes?
St. Andrews tried to get rid of me, but no, they didn't actually. So I did my postgrad at St. Andrews as well as my undergrad because I loved it there. I was initially quite nervous about going to St. Andrews because, well, it doesn't feel like a particularly Scottish place in some ways, because it does have such a dominant university presence within the town.
Right.
But as soon as I went there and started to settle in, it's beautiful. I loved being able to walk everywhere, and the library was fantastic. And from week one, I'd fallen in love with the medievalists. So in the undergrad process, I'd been sort of, just as you'd been dissertation shopping at Kalamazoo, I was dissertation shopping via the different modules I tried. Right. And I took this courtroom dramas module, and I thought, really, these legal sources really appeal to me. So I decided to stay on and do a PhD, and the rest was history. So when I was thinking about doing a PhD, I wanted to speak to my potential supervisor and just talk through some ideas. And one of the things we talked about was working with charters in the Anglo-Scottish region. And I don't know why, but it really appealed. It appealed the most out of all the things we talked about. So that's what I ended up doing. And it was a really interesting project to do a thesis in this topic. A few of the things sort of decided to do were to think about ways to make the best use of the material. So when I did my PhD on the Anglo-Scottish border region, I pulled together this massive database of charters, and I decided I wanted to use royal charters to try and use as many monastic cartularies and charters by members of the nobility and so on in the time period I chose, which was 1066 to 1250. There's not vast amount of material by people from a slightly lower social status. So quite limited in terms of dealing with the nobility. But by looking over quite a broad geographical area, which is sort of roughly Middle Britain, you can pull together lots of trends, and you can look for local change, community influence. You can look at the impact of beneficiary drafting. One of the big conversations that was sort of happening at the time I was doing my thesis was the start of the amazing research projects by David Broun, Paradox of Medieval Scotland, when it first started. And it was pulling together, trying to get a sense of who were the people in Scotland, and particularly following Rhys Davies' idea about how prominent in shaping the culture and identity of the Kingdom of Scotland was this area south of the Forth, right, where famously settled post-conquest with David I by people from northwestern continental Europe. Right. And was this a paradox? And this is sort of something that seems to have fallen a little bit out of favour now and then, but the idea for the thesis was to try and get past this fragmentation of a border and pull together Middle Britain to look for continuity across sites as well. And in some ways, when we think about Scotland, the border doesn't really come into being in a significant and a really formal way until quite late in the period I was studying. Right. The River Forth was much more important and as a boundary because of judicial circuits and so on. One of the things that the Paradox project pulled out was the volume of Gaelic charters through the north of the Forth part of Scotland, which is most of Scotland. There's a lot of Latin charters from the area that I was studying, a lot more than you see in some parts of Scotland, particularly the further north you go, the less there is. But volume of stuff, but simply because of the number of new monastic foundations that appeared post-conquest, was allowing me to build this amazingly huge database full of mundane charters to really quite unusual charters. So it was really fun to try and think about this area that doesn't tend to get a lot of attention. Right. Scotland between Forth and roughly the border, Stovig Brun, has gotten a phenomenal amount of attention relative to what happened before, because there was only really a few key works. There wasn't a huge number of Scottish historians even working on medieval Scotland.
Right.
But there's still a tendency to ignore England north of the Tees, pulling together an area where people tend not to look at, and which was in and of itself an area that had quite a lot of geographical and political continuity, and even quite a lot of cultural continuity,
Right.
was sort of the core idea behind the thesis, and how this adapted to the influx of monastic foundations and to the sort of transplanting in of new nobility. And new nobility who weren't even from 20 or 30 miles away, but who had come from quite a significant distance.
Yeah.
A lot of the big discourses that we see kind of characterise the Anglo-Norman period, the period after the Norman conquest, wherever they are, in fact. It doesn't matter if it's the Normans in the East or in Italy or Wales or Ireland. We get this, understand the post-conquest period as a period of creation, a period of change, and a period of change that's sort of partly volunteered by people inhabiting the area, partly volunteered by the new personnel who come into the area, who are given these incentives to come and settle in Scotland. But it's also partly forced through, and against quite a lot of resistance sometimes. And of course, any Scottish historians would be shouting at me, "You shouldn't even say conquest when you're talking about Scotland." And they're probably right, because we famously don't want to conquest, but do have a scale of change that is characteristic of some of the experiences that other places which experienced the dynastic change of the Normans also evidenced there.
Yeah, when you talk about the influx of new people in the borders, can you see from the charters kind of a unique picture of how these newcomers interacted with the locals?
It's a process that probably would look quite tedious to a lot of people, and it would confirm a lot of stereotypes about academics. The way in which language changed, and even specific words, kind of clusters around small, or is even the same word being used and reused by a family. It's interesting because it shows you where language in a legal document can vary and where it can't. And the stuff that can't vary increasingly becomes locked in the period that I'm studying. And it's a period where customary, less formal, less rigid legal systems are starting to become a bit more solidified, and kings are becoming a bit more specific. They're being backed by conversations and a court full of jurists telling them this is. Our equivalents in the 12th and 13th centuries say, we've all been talking and we think that this is what you need in your documents in order for them to be successful, which is always quite a fun thing to think about, because you can look at a monastic foundation, you can see these same kind of like the echo, the mirror of those sorts of conversations happening as well. Like, we need to get this stuff done. We need to make sure we hold on lands and all of these rights and these resources. So what can we vary in the charter? What can we try and be a bit more flexible about? But what has to absolutely be there so that we don't lose any land to our neighbour or so on, or to the king changing their mind, or what's going to make us vulnerable in the future.
Right.
Yeah, so if we're using horrible management speak, we talk about these conversations of future-proofing cartuaries, and it's really interesting to see that happening.
Oh, interesting, yeah.
Because it is a really interesting conversation, because it increasingly becomes the case that there's not so much that you can vary in a document without jeopardising your future rights and possession to whatever's being conveyed in that document. But there's a few areas where you can be a bit more flexible. So one part of the charter that always fascinates me and still does is the pro anima clause, because I love how they turn into shopping lists of dead relatives. But they're not always. That's a little bit. It's not only about people who've died, but it's about, you get this tiny snapshot of hopes for the future. And I know that sounds really cheesy, but you get this idea of them sitting down and thinking, who is important to me?
Yeah.
Who is important in the context of the grant? Because it's not always the same. Sometimes they've fallen out with Great Aunt Mildred. They still have to make sure that her soul is prayed for, or they're going to be in trouble. But they're all about, have I got kids yet? Am I going to have kids? Sometimes in charters you see the results of these conflicted family dynamics, and you can see tensions. You can see, I don't trust my son.
Right.
So what are you going to do? So it's really interesting. Piranha Claws are fantastic. You get to see all the drama, you get to see all the soap opera-esque angles to these family dynamics. And I think that's quite helpful in getting people to understand that legal history is not about the boring history nerd, the boring, very, very attention to detail, absolute perfection, that you need to be a good lawyer then and now. But it's about working with complex humans, which is, the best type of human.
Yeah, and it's just, it's one of the sources that we have. So, in order to work with them to get to the humans behind these documents, it, can take a lot of patience, but I think the reward is definitely worth it.
But yes, charters are cool. Charters are ace, and the more people who realize it.
Yes. And yeah, it's definitely not the kind of work for everybody, but I think the stuff that you do end up with as a final product is just invaluable for the rest of us that maybe don't have the patience to go through quite as detailed a massive amount of work and documents that others do.
Totally. If you just think about how charter scholarship has changed over the last 5 years, it's totally been transformed. And I mean, I guess some of those changes were coming for a bit earlier, but think about Joanna Tucker's work, understanding how cartularies are constructed and changed and how they're not constant. You don't just add another leaf in and make the book bigger and bigger. You rearrange things. You put other stuff in that's not a charter. You have all of these different process, and it becomes this very organic process. And thinking about how the legal sources represent that sort of conversation not even over the lifetime of a single scribe, but over multiple generations within a monastic foundation is really cool.
Right. Super fascinating. You mentioned that there are some really, really unique charters that you've been able to see. What is one of the most unique ones that kind of sticks out from your research?
It's a tough question, isn't it? I think like the funny ones stay with. So I do like the family drama tensions in the Piranha Claws, and then I like the random ones where that it's quite okay. So if I was thinking about a family, I like the Warren charters because I think they were quite a lively bunch, and there's some really weird things. So stuff like the 2-year-old. You get in the witness clauses, you get allegedly a 2-year-old witnessing a charter, and you kind of think, no, that's not happening. That's not happening. Including the witness, that doesn't make any sense at all.
Coming from experienced young children, that's probably not likely to have happened.
I bow to your greater knowledge of tiny children, but it's so weird. But it tells us a lot about establishing a track record. I mean, it's this great mental picture of a very hands-on mother establishing a good career history. Like she's building up the CV for her child as early as possible. And it pays off, works fine. But I like the weird ones. I like the weird ones like this. I like things that I get to see that they're really cross, that they can't, that they have to include a certain member on a Piranha Clause. Or there's some great ones in Northumberland. It's connected to Newminster Abbey and Brinkburn Priory, and you get some quite elaborate writing of the boundaries, and that's quite interesting because boundary clauses are classically very important Anglo-Saxon charters, but get the sense that in the borders there's a bit more for a longer period of time before this royal curia clampdown on the language of charters really comes into force. So you get to see these extra sort of measures that are reflecting customs being slipped in there just as a way to help sort of cobble together a bit more protection and a bit more security. So you get lovely descriptions of groups of men. It's always men, of course, but put that to one side. But
that's cool.
Faithful and wise. All of these, I love these value judgments on participants. I think that's really interesting. But the sad thing about it is, I quite like a very dull document. That's really unfair. I quite like a document that looks fairly standard. It looks fairly neat and short and unremarkable. But when you look at it with documents that were granted by family members before and after, when you look at other documents by their neighbours to the same religious house or, amongst each other, you can see that it's establishing a pattern of patronage, or that it's
right.
showing you that they've changed how they're getting on in their local community. And that sort of aspect is as exciting to me as a charter where you've got this lovely, weird, unexpected thing to it.
Yeah.
I mean, there's all sorts of fun stuff in charters, like looking at rent payments is fun. I know that doesn't sound fun, but when you have like, I'll give you this bit of land, but I want I want 6 chickens twice a year.
Right.
I want a pound of pepper, or somebody's. You get these little hints of where they've come from. So the persistence of aura, different coins. So sometimes you get peasants being mentioned. And it's quite exciting to think about, fairly small grand in southwest Scotland or northeast England is being secured by money that's come from Byzantium. It's a good reminder of the British Isles. Scotland is not remote. It's very closely connected to the rest of Europe, to broader Middle Ages.
Oh yeah, definitely. That's really fascinating, and I understand that a lot of what you have done was probably very tedious, but the end result is just so fascinating, and I'm so glad that you've done the research that you have.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's always a joy at the end of a longer day to have a chart. Like I grant this abbey because I'm building this abbey because I have put on so much weight I can't go on crusade. I can't go on pilgrimage. And who's that? William Le Gros of O'Neill founding Mews Abbey because he could not go. We've all been judgment. But when you get a charter like that, it's really funny. It's really interesting to get the idea of how that individual's life has progressed.
Yes. And that's fascinating. I love that.
Because you get this sense that, okay, as a high status noble, should be going on crusade, should be meeting certain goals to be a good Catholic, to be a good Christian, and to help enhance his status and so on. And because he is of such high status, he can't just do smaller acts of piety and so on.
Right.
He's got to do all the small. He's got to do the big scale stuff to prove that he deserves to be at the top of the heap, or almost at the top of the heap. So you get a really interesting insight into he's had a very good life, potentially some health problems. You don't actually know what's caused the weight gain either.
Right, exactly.
That's something I didn't think I'd end up talking about.
Medieval weight gain, yeah. That's fascinating. Yeah, see, you could get, I love how you can get down to the, like, this is what real people were through the charters. It's fascinating, yeah.
So my research has changed a wee bit over the last few years in that I've been doing it in the field of medievalisms. And so one of the things I've been researching is looking at regional history. And it's partly because I'm from the northeast of Scotland and I'm frustrated by the absence of medieval sources and surviving medieval content. And it's a real shame because Scotland, like the Mearns, was a massive administrative district and fairly wealthy and has what is, in my opinion, one of the best medieval sites in the world ever, which is Dunnottar Castle and the amazing Keiths.
Yes.
But I can appreciate that I maybe talk about Dunnottar Castle a bit too.
I don't think you can possibly talk about Dunnottar too much. No.
It's awesome, isn't it? It's one of the best castles ever. Dunnottar Castle. It's so cool.
It is a really cool one. It's fascinating.
I love the fact that it's the model in Brave.
Yes.
I love the fact that it appears in so many documentaries. I love the fact that it is so iconic. But it is a brilliant site. I'm giving a paper at our history talks in September on a little episode in the Mearns medievalisms. I'm looking at the legend of Fenella, and Fenella is recorded in John of Fordun.
Okay.
In later medieval, but she is allegedly an aggrieved woman who is compensating for the death of her family member by assassinating a king, allegedly.
Oh.
So it's one of these stories that's rooted in the distinction between folklore and history and so on, if you were a modern colleague talking about historiography. But it's really interesting as an event that people pick out in different genres, because the legend of Fenella is preserved in the topography, in the place names, but it's all picked up on by artists and poets and playwrights.
Oh, interesting.
And it's alive still in the local community, which is really very interesting.
Oh, that's
There's still a pool of fenellas. I think probably, I haven't done any study into this yet, but I think probably the biggest cluster of fenellas, because it's not a fashionable name at the moment, is probably rooted in Fettercairn and surrounding villages. But it's a legend that captures the imagination, and it right understood through the lens of medievalism. So I am giving a talk on precisely that. The reason why I wanted to do that was because I feel, as somebody brought up in rural Aberdeenshire on the coast, I feel sad that there aren't more, apart from Dunnottar is amazing.
Right.
I'm sad that there aren't more visible aspects of our medieval past, and I can appreciate that this wasn't necessarily a hugely populated area, but there are places in the Mearns in the northeast that were hugely important to medieval Scottish history.
Oh yeah,
and
it's very important stuff.
It is, isn't it? But nobody cares. Like it's as a side note, it's a fascinating conversation in the distinction between region and nation.
Yeah.
And authorised heritage discourses and so on. So it's really interesting in that regard. But we also at the moment have a bit of a heritage crisis on the coast. I mean, it's not unique to Scotland, but there are 2 or 3 sites just along the coast of the Mearns that are already very eroded, but now they might not be able to be salvaged.
Right.
Castle and Came of Mather's Castle. And there's not much left of the latter. I'm sure you're very familiar with these sites, but they're very precarious.
Yeah.
And the other site I didn't even know about is in Milton Haven, where it's a medieval village, and it was reclaimed by the sea after the community there built lime kilns, and they destroyed the protective lime barrier.
Oh, interesting.
Which was keeping the wild North Sea from submerging villages now submerged. But there's this amazing Brigadoon Atlantis sort of aspect to it now. I'm definitely too much, because it's a medieval village,
right? But
on certain tides, the whole thing gets washed out with all the stones, and you get to see the foundations of some of the cottages. And of course, these are not all dating to medieval,
right?
Cottages from the early modern period and so on as well. Buildings and outhouses and agricultural things. But when you get the sense of when the conditions are right, you get to glimpse the past again. But unfortunately, it's not very often. So by giving this paper, it's one way to try and make a public the idea that there is a history in the northeast that's pre-oil. I think the change in this part of the world in the 1970s.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining me today and talking to me about your journey to studying medieval Scotland and the charters. It's been super fascinating.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Hi, everyone. A quick announcement before I sign off. The Scotta Chronicast has found a home with medievalists.net, where you can find a bunch of wonderful articles, videos, and podcasts relating to the Middle Ages. You should go check it out. And if you like what you are reading and hearing, consider becoming a patron of medievalists.net on Patreon.
Thank you for joining us on the Scotta Chronicast. Please rate and review wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can also follow our account on Twitter @ScottaChronicast. Our music is Ex to Lux Oratur by Gaita. Thanks for listening.